The road into the quarantine zone wasn't on any map they'd updated since the war. Dr. Senna Voss knew it by the way the forest pressed in. Pines so tall, they scraped the bellies of the low clouds, the kind of ancient growth that made you feel the planet was still deciding whether it wanted you here. She drove with both hands on the wheel, and the dosimeter clipped to her jacket collar, clicking once every few minutes. Not alarm fast, just thoughtful. Just reminding her. Her brother had been out here for 11 weeks. The Gen had introduced the pathogen 3 months ago. Not dropped it, not launched it, introduced it, the way you'd introduce a culture into a petri dish. Methodical, scientific. The translation drones had broadcast their reasoning in clipped, flattened tones that somehow made it worse. Accelerated adaptive pressure. Observe and record. They were studying what happened to human biology when exposed to a viral agent engineered to target the gene sequences unique to mammalian nervous tissue. They'd called it a kindness. A more efficient method than bombardment. No infrastructure damage, they said, no collateral. Just the slow, particular erasure of everything that made a human mind work. Senna was a virologist. Had been before the Shen came. Before the field stations and the quarantine grids, and the way the word patient stopped meaning someone you tried to save, and started meaning someone you tried to understand before you lost them. Her brother Matthias had been exposed in the second wave. He'd been doing soil analysis for a reforestation project when the aerosol hit the valley. 7 days later, he couldn't hold a pen. 14 days later, he couldn't form new memories. By week 3, the government had quarantined the valley and everyone in it, and Senna had started driving out every Thursday with a cooler of compounds she wasn't supposed to be synthesizing. The cabin was 2 miles past the checkpoint. She'd talked her way through so many times she knew the guard's coffee order. "Voss," said the young one, leaning out of the booth. She noticed he'd put a hand-drawn sketch on the wall behind him. A bird, she thought, or a kid's idea of a bird. Holiday. She held up her ID and her medical clearance and the small laminated card that said she had authorization to visit quarantine subject 14B for the purposes of therapeutic assessment. None of it was entirely true anymore, but the card was real. He waved her through without checking the cooler. She drove the last stretch, listening to the dosimeter and the wind in the pines, and trying not to think about what Matthias's voice had sounded like the week before. Lower, somehow, the consonants softened, as if the disease were smoothing him out, rounding the edges of him. She'd looked up the Shen word for what they were doing to human nervous tissue. The closest translation was refining. The cabin sat in a clearing that the trees seemed reluctant to enter. Matthias had chosen it himself 12 years ago, when he'd been a field researcher who needed quiet and elevation and somewhere to put his telescope. The scope was still on the porch, pointed at nothing in particular. There was a new addition since last week. A length of copper wire strung from a pine branch to the rain gutter, coiled at the bottom around something she couldn't make out from the car. She killed the engine and sat for a moment. The dosimeter clicked once. She got the cooler out of the back and walked up the 3 porch steps and knocked. This was the part that never got easier. The pause before the door opened, when she didn't know which version of him she was going to find. The door opened, and it was a version she hadn't seen before. Matthias looked alert, more than alert. He looked like he'd been awake for 3 days running on something other than caffeine. Eyes bright and too wide, the kind of brightness that could tip either way. He'd lost weight she hadn't noticed losing over the weeks, and it showed suddenly all at once. But he was standing straight, which he hadn't been doing for 2 weeks, and he was holding a notebook, which she'd thought he'd given up. "You're early," he said. "I'm exactly on time." "No, you're early." He stepped back to let her in. "I've been calculating the drive time, and you're 4 minutes ahead of your average. That matters today." She looked at him as she set the cooler on the table. "Why does it matter today?" He was already moving toward the far corner of the cabin, where he'd pushed the furniture back. She hadn't noticed on her last visits, or maybe it hadn't been there, but the corner was covered in notes. Paper notes, handwritten, pinned to the bare log wall in a pattern that at first looked like chaos and then, as her eyes adjusted, started to look like something else. A diagram. A circuit, maybe, or a map of something that wasn't geography. Because I think I've got it, Matthias said. Senna set her jacket down. Got what? How it works. He tapped the notebook against his palm. The pathogen. What it's actually doing. He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his face she couldn't read yet. Something new, which was unusual, because she'd known his face for 34 years. Senna, what if it isn't destroying anything? She made herself breathe normally. This was part of the job now, the therapeutic assessment that wasn't entirely fictional. You didn't correct the disorganized thinking head-on. You listened. You looked for the thread of something real. Walk me through it, she said. He sat down at the kitchen table, and she pulled a chair across from him, and he opened the notebook, and she saw, with a jolt she didn't show, that the handwriting was clean, precise, better than his handwriting had been in the early weeks of exposure. The Shen pathogen targets mammalian neural sequences, he said. Everyone agrees on that. The COE team, your lab, the Vantiri group, all the modeling says it's degrading the neural architecture. That's what we're seeing in the tissue samples. You're seeing changes in the tissue samples. He held up a finger. It wasn't a correction exactly. It was the gesture he'd used when they were kids, and he thought she'd missed something. Changes you're interpreting as degradation because they don't match baseline human neural morphology. He opened the notebook to a spread of hand-drawn graphs. But I've been running the math on my own symptom progression, and something doesn't add up. Senna, the memory formation issues I had in weeks 2 and 3, they're gone. She said nothing. The motor coordination issues, gone. The processing delays. He set the notebook flat on the table and smoothed it with his palm. I'm not declining anymore. I haven't been for 2 weeks. I've been. He stopped, looked at the wall. I've been changing. Matthias, I know how it sounds. He met her eyes. But I need you to look at something before you tell me I'm wrong. He went to the copper wire on the porch, the coiled end. She followed. Up close, she could see it was wound around a small device she recognized, one of his old geological sensors, the kind that measured electromagnetic variation in soil composition. He'd modified it. She could see the soldered additions, the careful rerouting of the leads, and wired it to a handheld display he must have had from his field research kit. I've been mapping the pathogen's activity, he said, not just in me in the valley. He handed her the display. The readout was a 3-dimensional model, rotating slowly, and it took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. Then she did understand, and she stood very still. The pathogen wasn't distributed randomly through the quarantine zone. It was structured. It had geometry, not the loose diffusion of an airborne agent, but the deliberate architecture of a network. And at the center of the network, pulsing in the model's rendering at a slow, steady interval, was the cabin. Or, she realized, Matthias. It's using me as a hub, he said quietly, or I've become one. I'm not sure of the causality yet. He took the display back. But I think, Senna, I think the Shen weren't lying when they called it a kindness. I think what they actually did is more frightening than a weapon. And also, and I know, this is the part where you want to tell me, I'm symptomatic. Also maybe something we could use. She sat down on the porch steps. The forest pressed around the clearing. The dosimeter clicked. Tell me, she said. He sat beside her and began. It took her 4 hours to verify enough of it to stop saying no. She'd brought the right equipment, as it happened. Not because she'd known, but because she always brought everything she could fit in the cooler, compounds and analyzers both, because Matthias had been a researcher long enough that she never knew when he'd have a question she could answer on the spot. She ran his blood markers against the pathogen model he'd built, and the numbers were wrong. In the exact way he'd predicted they'd be wrong. The pathogen wasn't eating his neural tissue. It was restructuring it, slowly, carefully, at a cellular level that would have been invisible to the scans they'd been running because the scans had been designed to look for damage. No one had thought to look for improvement. No one had thought the Zhen were capable of something that subtle. "They're not making us sick," Senna said. She was sitting on the floor of the cabin with her analyzer in her lap and the results on the small screen, and she said it slowly. "The way you said something when you were afraid that saying it fast would make it true too quickly and you'd lose the chance to reconsider. They're not making us sick, they're upgrading," Matthias said. "That's their word. That's the Shen frame. I know. I'm not saying it's benign. I'm saying it's what they're doing." He was standing by the wall of notes, adding something in the margin of one sheet. "The question is whether the upgrade is one-directional." She looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means," he turned. In the late afternoon light coming through the cabin window, he looked the way he'd looked when they were in their 20s, and he'd been the one in the lab, and she'd been the one in the field, and they'd been equal at everything and afraid of nothing. "It means the network has a structure, and structures have vulnerabilities, and if I'm a hub," he tapped the side of his head, "then maybe I can push back." She should have told him it was the disease talking. She'd spent 11 weeks building the vocabulary for that conversation. She knew which expressions to use, which tone, how to be gentle without being condescending. She had the whole framework ready. Instead, she said, "Show me the network architecture again." The Shen Oversight Station was 17 kilometers northeast, in the high meadow where their first landing craft had come down, and they'd never bothered to move it. Senna knew because she'd driven past it on her first trip out here, before the checkpoints, when the occupation was still new enough that you could drive past things without fully understanding what you were looking at. 3 structures, pale as birch bark, arranged in a triangle. No perimeter fence. They didn't need one. Everything within 4 kilometers of the station was instrumented. Atmospheric sensors, acoustic arrays, the biological monitors that were essentially the pathogen, doing double duty as a surveillance network. Everything biological within 4 kilometers of the station was part of their network, including Matthias for 11 weeks, including Senna for the last 4 hours. She drove back to the checkpoint at exactly the right speed. She smiled at Holiday and said, "He's about the same," which was what she always said, and Holiday nodded and went back to his handheld, and she drove through and out the other side and pulled over 2 kilometers down the road and sat with her hands on the wheel until they stopped shaking. In the cooler, under the remaining compounds, she had Matthias's notebook and the modified geological sensor and a blood sample she'd taken from herself before she left, and a decision she hadn't finished making. The dosimeter was quiet. She'd clipped it to the cooler handle when she packed up, and she hadn't heard it click since she left the cabin. Either the exposure level was dropping as she drove away from the quarantine zone, or the pathogen had already done what it needed to do, and there was nothing left for the dosimeter to measure. She thought about the network model, the hub, the slow, steady pulse at the center. She thought about Matthias saying push back. She thought about the Shen station in the high meadow, 17 kilometers northeast, with its 3 pale structures and its biological monitoring network that had been reading human neural activity for 11 weeks and building a picture of human cognitive function that no one on Earth had thought to try to read in return. No one had been in a position to read it in return, until now. She made the decision the way you made the big ones. Not all at once, but in pieces. The last piece dropping into place so quietly that afterward you could never quite say when it had happened. She turned the car around. The checkpoint guard was different on the outbound lane. She used the medical clearance card again, and a story about leaving a piece of equipment, and the guard was tired enough that he didn't question the cooler going back in instead of out. She drove back through the pines. The dosimeter stayed quiet. Matthias was at the wall of notes when she came in. He didn't look surprised. "I thought you'd come back," he said. "I didn't know I was going to." "I know." He turned. "The network told me." She set the cooler on the table and looked at him for a long moment. "How long have you been able to do that? Reliably?" "About 4 days." He came and sat at the table. It's not like reading minds. It's more like, he thought about it. You know how you can tell when someone enters a room before you see them? The change in air pressure, the floor settling under their weight, something peripheral. It's like that, but for intent. The Shen can do this too. The Shen built this. So yes. He folded his hands on the table, but here's what they didn't account for. They modeled human neural function from the outside. 11 weeks of observation, all the data they wanted. But they were watching us the way you'd watch a machine, inputs and outputs. They don't have a model for what we do with information once it's inside. He paused. They don't have a model for what I've been doing for 11 weeks with everything I've learned about their network. She sat down. Which is learning its grammar, he said it simply. Every network has one. Rules for how information moves, where it pools, where it's vulnerable to disruption. I've had 11 weeks inside their system, and I'm very good at patterns. You know that about me. She knew that about him. She'd known it since he was 7 years old, and had mapped the entire watershed behind their childhood home in a single afternoon, because he'd noticed that the water moved in a grammar and wanted to understand it. She pulled the geological sensor from the cooler. She'd been thinking, on the drive back, about what he'd said about the structure having vulnerabilities, about hubs, about what happened when you introduced a disruption at the center of a network rather than at the edge. If you push a signal back through the network, she said slowly, what hits the station? Matthias was quiet for a moment. Everything they've sent us, he said, amplified, reflected. In a language they wrote. He met her eyes. They'll recognize it immediately. It won't be subtle. What will it do to the station? I don't know exactly. His voice was careful. I think it'll be loud. And to you? He looked at the table. I don't know that either. A long pause. But Sina, they're in 400 quarantine zones. Not just ours. The network is planetary. If the hub here can reflect a signal coherent enough to propagate. He stopped. Shook his head slowly. They built something out of us. And it turns out we're better at it than they expected. She thought about the word refining. She thought about what it meant to be refined by something and come out changed in a direction the refiner hadn't planned for. She thought about a man in a cabin in the Oregon pines who'd spent 11 weeks becoming fluent in the grammar of an alien intelligence because he was very good at patterns and had nothing else to do. Tell me what you need me to do, she said. What he needed was simple in the way that simple things can be terrifying. He needed a clean signal path out of the cabin and into the open air where the network could receive it. And he needed Senna to calibrate the sensor array while he concentrated, because the thing he was about to do required his full attention and he couldn't split it. She spent 40 minutes with the sensor and the modified display, mapping the local network density while he sat at the table with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes open and not looking at anything in the room. She'd seen him concentrate before. He had a quality of stillness that had always unsettled people who didn't know him, a complete withdrawal from the surface of himself, while something worked deeper. But this was different. This was the stillness of something that had learned a new way to be still. The display showed the network pulsing around them. She could see it clearly now. The quarantine zone lit up like a city at night, biological nodes scattered across the valley floor, and at the center the bright, steady point of Matthias, reading stronger than anything else in the grid by an order of magnitude. 11 weeks. They'd given him 11 weeks to become this, and hadn't thought to check whether the hub could transmit as well as receive. Ready, she said. He didn't answer immediately. Then, without moving, the signal will propagate outward. You should feel something in about 10 seconds. Don't be frightened. I'm already frightened. The corners of his mouth moved. Almost a smile. Good, me too. She watched the display. She didn't know exactly what she expected, some flash of light, some dramatic shift in the sensor readings. What happened was quieter than that and stranger. The network display, which had been pulsing at its steady, slow interval, paused, like a heartbeat skipping, like a breath held. And then Matthias began to push. She felt it as pressure behind her eyes and a sudden, overwhelming sense of familiarity, like recognizing a place you'd never been, like déjà vu stripped of its uncanny quality and replaced with something factual. She understood without being told that she was feeling the signal find its shape, that what Matthias was broadcasting was not aggression and not chaos but information. Everything the Shen network had sent into the quarantine zone, metabolized and transformed by 11 weeks of a human mind that was very good at patterns, compressed into a pulse that spoke the network's own language back to it at maximum amplitude. The display went white. Then it came back, and the network was still there, all the biological nodes still glowing. But the central point, the Shen station in the high meadow, was dark, not destroyed. She checked the readings twice, not destroyed, but silent, disconnected. And across the bottom of the display, propagating in a slow wave from their location outward to the edges of the sensor range, she watched the other nodes in the network begin to change, brightening, one by one like people looking up. "Matthias," she said, "I see it." His voice was tired but steady. He hadn't moved his hands from the table. "The signal is propagating. It'll hit the other quarantine zones within." He paused, calculated, hours, maybe less. She stared at the display, 400 quarantine zones. 400 valleys like this one, with people in them who'd spent weeks or months being slowly, carefully refined by something that had not stopped to consider that refinement can go in directions you don't plan for, that when you spend long enough changing something, the something starts to change back. "They'll know what happened," she said. "Yes, they'll adjust. Yes." He lifted his hands from the table and turned them over, looking at his palms. "But they'll have to start over, and they'll have to account for us in their models now." He looked up. "Really account for us. Not just our inputs and outputs." She thought about what it meant to be understood by something vast and alien and methodical. She thought about what it meant that the understanding now had to go both ways. "Is it enough?" she asked. "Just disrupting the station?" "No," he said. "It's not enough. But it's a language they recognize, and we just spoke in it for the first time." He stood up slowly, the way you stand when you've been sitting in one place long enough for your body to have committed to stillness. "They came here to study what happens to us under pressure, what we're capable of when everything familiar is stripped away." He walked to the window and looked out at the pine forest and the low clouds and the clearing the trees were reluctant to enter. "I think they got their answer." She stood beside him. Outside, the pines were very still. The dosimeter on the cooler handle was silent. "We should document everything," she said. "The synthesis pathway, the signal structure, your symptom regression data. All of it. If this propagates to the other zones, the other hubs will find their way." He glanced at her. "But yes, we should document." She thought about the drive out here, the checkpoints, the dosimeter clicking, the guard with his hand-drawn bird, the way she'd sat in the parked car with her hands shaking and made the decision in pieces. She thought about 11 weeks of a man in a cabin talking to an alien network in its sleep, learning its grammar, figuring out what it had made him into, and deciding that made it something he could use. She thought, this is the thing they couldn't model. Not the cognitive architecture, not the neural plasticity, not the adaptive capacity, though all of that too, all of that had mattered. But the specific human thing, the thing underneath the biology, the stubbornness, the absolute refusal to be a subject in someone else's experiment without turning it into your own. Matthias reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small flask, the kind field researchers carry, dented at one corner from years of use. He looked at it, then at her. "I've been saving this," he said. She recognized it. She'd given it to him at the start of the reforestation project, the last time she'd seen him before the exposure. A small bottle of the whiskey they'd been drinking since their father had first given it to them, the summer they were 19 and 21, and thought they understood what adulthood meant. "You've had that in quarantine for 3 months," she said. "I wanted to wait for something worth opening it for." He looked at the flask, then out the window, then at the silent display, where the network map was still shifting in its slow, brightening wave. "I think this qualifies." She took it when he held it out. The metal was warm from his pocket. She opened it and smelled 11 weeks of waiting and something that smelled like home, and took a sip and handed it back. "We still have a lot of work," she said. "We always have a lot of work." He took his sip, recapped the flask, put it back in his pocket. "That's never the question." She looked at the pine forest. Somewhere out there, 17 kilometers northeast, a pale structure sat silent in a high meadow, its biological network disrupted, its models insufficient, its 11 weeks of careful data suddenly inadequate to the thing it had been studying. The dosimeter stayed quiet. The pines pressed close around the clearing, and the clouds sat low on the mountains, and her brother stood beside her in the window of a cabin in the Oregon wilderness. 11 weeks changed, patient, zero of something the Shen had not expected to create, a human being who had learned the shape of an alien intelligence from the inside and found its grammar and spoken back in it so fluently that an occupying network had for the first time gone quiet to listen. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't a battle. It wasn't the kind of thing that would look, from the outside, like anything at all. It was a scientist in a cabin and his sister, with a cooler full of compounds and 11 weeks of careful, stubborn, relentless thinking. It was the specific thing humans do when you put them in a small room with a problem and leave them there long enough. They stop being the problem and start being the solution. Outside, the signal was still propagating, slow and steady, outward and outward and outward.